Hi, my name is Harry, and for anyone that doesn't know me, I love Jesus a whole lot. I've got a wife and two kids who I love a whole lot too, and I have the best job in the world, which releases me to help people go deeper in relationship to Jesus. Last week we had Dave Gregg tell us about the power of remembering the goodness of God in our lives and how that is one of the most effective tools in our arsenal in sharing about Jesus. You remember that Dave visibly demonstrated this by bringing his wife's sword and chopping off a deformed watermelon Goliath head. Well, today I want to kind of bring the other side of the coin to the power of using our voice and talk about listening to the voice. The first time that we really see about hearing the voice of God is right at the start of Genesis. In chapter 1, we have the divine command, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Then in chapter 2, the Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat from it, you will surely die. Now, many of us will be very familiar with the story. Adam and Eve, they just don't obey it. They're tempted by the snake and they eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, what's interesting is what God comes and says to Adam. Now, pay attention here because this runs through the rest of what I'm going to talk about. What he says is, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and you've eaten from the tree about which I command you saying, don't eat it. Cursed is the ground. You'll work the land and it will be hard to work the land. And you'll return to the dust from where you were made. So, it's all about listening. You listen to the voice of another human instead of listening to my voice. Right here in the story, listening to the voice of God is synonymous with obeying the divine command. So what's the problem? The problem is humans don't listen to the voice of God and obey his command. They listen to each other's voices, which very often are being influenced by the voice of a greater evil, by a lie of a greater force of evil. And you start to see the fundamental biblical plot conflict that is about humans not obeying the divine command. They're failing the test. It's about this test of listening. And that sets the core pattern of divine commands that test human failure to not listen. And that phrase, listening to the voice, is really key within it. So you walk away from the story going, oh, man, well, what we need is some humans who will really listen to the voice of God. And so we fast forward in Genesis to Abraham. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, God speaks to him in a poem. And he says these words, go forth from your land and leave your relatives behind you, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in all the families of the earth, you will be blessed. What a promise this is. But there's just this one condition, leave your land and leave your family. It's like separating you from your old humanity to a new and different kind of human. Leave your family behind. And we're told Abraham leaves the land. And then we're told, and Lot's nephew went with him. And right here, you're supposed to clue into what is taking place here. Abraham didn't listen to the whole command. And that's all that the narrative says. It's just this little line, and Lot went with him. And you're supposed to just be saying, wait, what's taking place? Why isn't he listening to the whole command? He was supposed to go, just him and his wife. And you see that in the following stories, the consequences of Abraham not listening are that Lot becomes the source of innumerable problems. And he doesn't fully listen. And it's not the only time that Abraham does this. In the story about Hagar, the Egyptian slave, God says to Abraham and Sarah, I'm going to give you a family and a great nation. And so Sarah and Abraham, they get impatient, and so they decide to go about it in their own wisdom. to create a family. And when we read the story, it's riffing again off what's taking place in Genesis 3. So in Genesis 16, it says, and Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. And again, that's cluing us into something that's already happened with Adam and Eve. And you're like, oh no. And then it goes on to confirm the bad stuff that's going on. Sarah took Hagar and gave to Abraham. It's the exact same language that is used of the fruit. And this is the literary ninjas at work once again, showing you how the story of people not listening to the voice of God is working. And you're supposed to be going, this is really, really bad. The only difference is that instead of the snake being at the forefront of the story, he's now in the background. They see Hagar, they take Hagar, and they do what is good in their eyes to her. And it's just this huge, big mess that comes from that situation. So now Abraham and Sarah, they've done great evil in trying to fulfill the divine promise in their own wisdom. They abused an Egyptian woman. He sleeps with her in trying to get his own heir out of it. Then he has to downgrade her son, and it's just this terrible situation. It creates all these problems of broken relationships, and it's all based off their own failure to obey the divine command. When Abraham and Sarah finally do get a son, they've done terrible things to other people to get it. And so God asks is that he puts Abraham to the test. And it's a big one. We read about it in Genesis 22, where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son. And the narrative says God tested Abraham. So you know that this is a test. But what God tests is just how far are you willing to go to have your own son. You've been willing to abuse an Egyptian slave and disenfranchised her son in doing it. So he does this test. And he's about to offer up Isaac. Then God, what you, the reader, knew, what just had to happen at some point, God comes and says, stop. And here's what happens following that. God says, by myself, I've sworn because you've done this thing that you haven't withheld your own son, your only one. Indeed, I will greatly bless you. I'll multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and the sand on the seashore. Your seed will possess the gate of your enemies, and your seed, all the nations of the earth, will be blessed. Let's just pause there. That's the fulfillment. It's a restatement of what God said in the first place. God said earlier, I'm going to do these things for you, but then Lot with him, and you're like, no. But here he comes and he listens and he passes the test. And you're like, this is it. This is finally happening. See, when a human passes the test, it releases a blessing to the nations. And then in the last line of this, it says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have listened to my voice. And then watch this. 4 chapters later, Abraham's just died, and Abraham's son Isaac, whose life exists because of the mercy of God that had taken place during what we've just talked about. God restates the promise to Isaac. He says, I'm going to establish those things that I swore to your father Abraham. I'll multiply your descendants as the stars of the heavens. I'll give your descendants these lands. By your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And you're like, yes, this is what God said to Abraham. And then he says, because Abraham listened to my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my Torah. And you're like, wait, the commandments, statutes, and the Torah, they don't even exist yet. That is still to come. That revelation hasn't come and hit them. And this is really important. This is what the story of the garden and Abraham listening to God's voice is all about. It's the equivalent to keeping the law of the Torah. And that is the narrative that is set in as the introduction to the covenant story of God in Israel and the laws that we come to see in the book of Exodus. You see, most people, when they read the first 5 books of the Bible, they think, look at all these laws. The Old Testament is about how God wants you to obey laws. But the New Testament is about how God wants you to live by faith. And that's exactly the opposite point that Jesus and Paul later are trying to get at. And Genesis is doing that here when it introduces Abraham as the first one who follows the Torah by listening to God's voice and living by faith. To live by faith is to obey the commands of the Torah without even knowing them. They haven't even been revealed yet. In other words, the narrative is winking at you when he says, Abraham kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and the laws of the Torah. It's winking at you because he knows he's going to tell you a story continuing on about people who actually get really clear statements of the laws and statutes and commands. They've been rescued from slavery in Egypt, and yet they still don't listen to the voice. But their forefathers did, without even knowing. This theme continues on. When you get to Mount Sinai, when the law is revealed, the people of Israel, they're sitting below this mountain. And this is the prologue to the law, the first laws. It's the prologue to the 10 commandments. When the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, God says, you saw what I did to the Egyptians. I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will, and in Hebrew it's repeated twice, if you will, listen to my voice. And this is synonymous. What he's saying is keeping my covenant. To listen to the voice is to keep the covenant. Then you will be my possession among the nations. You'll be my kingdom of priests and a holy nation. You get a narrative of the laws of the covenant. And then the first narrative after that is the making of the golden calf, a foreign god that the Israelites want to worship. And that golden calf story, when you look into it, it's all the vocabulary that we see in the story of Genesis 3. And it's all riffing off that. And you're like, here we go again. And we can see that the narrative argument of the Torah is about how humans don't listen. But there was one moment when Abraham did. And that act of obedience was an act of faith that released blessing to the nations. And it was in that act, Abraham, it was as if he was obeying all the laws of the Torah in that one act. But Abraham has one moment of success among a lifetime of failures. But it gives you a category of like, yes, okay, a human who always and only listens to the voice of God. If that's what we need around here so that the blessing can permanently be released to all of the nations, that's great. Could it be Moses, Israel, Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon, the other kings, Elijah, Elisha, Daniel? But each in some way fail. In the book of Jeremiah and in the book of Ezekiel too, when the people are sitting in exile after having for 400 years not listened to the voice, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the only thing they can imagine of how this can be solved is in Jeremiah's words of God writing the laws of the Torah on the heart so that everyone knows who God is. It's not even what you know that is good and evil, you just know God. And your life becomes just a natural expression of what the commands were all about. And Ezekiel says it's by God's Spirit that replaces your heart, that compels you to follow the laws of the Torah. They are a narrative about how humans perpetually fail to listen to the voice. And that's always been the covenant, to listen to the voice. The story and calling of the Bible has always been about listening to the voice. And a series of covenants were revealed throughout the story of the Bible. One of them has 611 examples of how to listen to the voice, but it's couched in a narrative of how they continually fail to do it, creating a need, as Moses comes and says, for the transformation of the heart. So the whole Old Testament is really a new covenant document, and it shows you why we need fundamentally a different kind of divine human relationship. And this is what the life of Jesus and the work of the Spirit is all about. Jesus comes along and you read and you hear and you experience him, where he says, I only do what I see the Father doing. Where he says, I only say what the Father taught me. And then you see how Micah, in his summation of the law, says he does justice, he loves mercy, and he walks humbly with God. And he does this in his treatment of the poor and lowly, the outcast and the sick, the downtrodden and dejected. And you realize this is the one who obeyed the voice and through whom the blessings of God can be unleashed to the world. But the story, it doesn't end with Jesus. We read of the sending of the Spirit and the explosive impact of the early church had. And you can read history and see how the Spirit has transformed lives, consistently demonstrating the goodness of God. And today, history continues to be written by people like you and me. Abraham's one act of listening to the voice was a catalyst that saw blessing released not just to his family, but to nations. What could happen with a universal church that does the same? Recently, for me, I don't know what it's been like for you, but in a time where it seems like we've all had the right excuses for slowing down, I feel like that I've been busier than ever. I've realized that I've been neglectful in shaping my relationship, not just with my God, but my wife, my kids, my family, my friends. And so the saying goes, if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. And the hive of activity and the noise of life mean that the urgent begins to usurp the important. You pay attention to the shouting of the world when God is whispering, not so that he's hard to hear, but so that you draw close to him. My wife said to me during this time, Harry, I love you, but you're here and you're not present. And I want all of you here and present with me. I was hurt that I could have unknowingly do something like that to her. But again, I was blessed that my wife loved me so much that she was willing to see me hurt to make things better. And we've worked hard to make that right. And recently I asked God where I was with him, and he said, Harry, I love you, but you're here and you're not present. It's only when I'm close with God that I can be the best version of myself. I have to make sure I'm aware of where I am with my relationships, and especially to God. How can I expect to be a good father, husband, son, brother, friend, leader, colleague when I'm not drawing close to God? I love my job to the hilt, but I need to make sure that in my time and energy given to it, I don't make it and its activity into an idol. You know, there's a special kind of sword that was designed with new Viking technology, where they were able to create a really pure steel in a one-time moment, rather than hammering out the impurity that other medieval blacksmiths were accustomed to doing. You know, when we follow Jesus, his death and resurrection on the cross was a one-time act that dealt with the impurities of the world, with all the mess that you and me have caused in our lives and others as well. And it's dealt with before God. But what comes next is the making of us. You know, for the sword, the blacksmith and his apprentice, they would spend hours and hours, days and days of well-judged and delicate hammer strikes to mold the steel into a weapon. In any of the processes of hammering, cooling, polishing, inlaying, sharpening, it was an easy thing to actually come and destroy, break the sword. The point is, to make the sword into something that is strong and can be used, it took a crazy amount of time, care, and attention. And if I want to be a good dad, husband, leader, follower of Jesus, it will take that careful attention to the small things in my relationship to him. And it really is the small things that make the big difference. Jesus makes time with God a priority. Luke tells us that he would often withdraw to the wilderness to pray. Even if the need was urgent, he wouldn't be drawn away from what was important. Jesus calls us to love God with all that we have and to love each person as we do ourselves. And Paul, in his writings, wants us to pay attention to the small things. In his final words in his letter to the church in Thessalonica, he says this, "But we request of you, brethren, that you appreciate those who diligently labor among you and have charge over you in the Lord and give you instruction, and that you esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Live in peace with one another. We urge you, brethren, admonish the unruly, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak. Be patient with everyone. See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good, for one another and for all people. Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. Do not quench the spirit. Do not despise prophetic utterances, but examine everything carefully. Hold fast to that which is good, and abstain from every form of evil." Pay attention to the small things. Spend time with Jesus and listen to his voice. The result, an individual, a family, a community that stands and rests with God, that moves when he does, and it's a prophetic declaration to a world caught up in a fog of hopelessness. You are the light through that fog, and we can turn up its brightness in listening to the voice. If you're able to now, just take a moment while this music plays to quiet yourself and to listen to his voice, to ask God where you are with him, where he wants you to be, and how you can get there. Make some time in the next weeks where you can be quiet and just listen.